You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 8th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, Hamas has a new leader in Gaza. We'll ask who he is and how he might influence the future direction of the conflict. Then,
we have to tell our children, look, this is the future. And they have to understand that business is only not for making money. We can solve all the problems that we have around us if we bring our creative power and take our greed out of the picture.
Nobel laureate Professor Muhammud Yunus, who's been appointed the head of the interim government in Bangladesh there. We'll hear a conversation I had with him earlier and also look at what the ousting of Sheikh Hasina means for New Delhi's relationship with Dhaka. We'll be in Kyiv catching up with our Ukrainian researcher who's just returned home for the first time in a year. Plus,
this is going to, ironically, prolong what has already been a much too lengthy process. The day of reckoning is going to be put off by, I think, a couple more years.
We'll hear why the US Defense Secretary has rejected a plea deal for the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Also, Simon Marks will have a look through the papers with us, and we'll have a roundup of aviation news before joining our colleagues in Paris to hear about the latest episode in our special Olympic series later today. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Last night, Britain was prepared for expected far-right violence, but instead, thousands of police and anti-racism protesters gathered on streets across the country to challenge the spate of recent racist attacks. Taylor Swift's 3 shows in Vienna this week have been cancelled after the government confirmed a planned terrorist attack at the concert stadium. And Australian Olympic hockey player Tom Craig was released from police custody with a warning yesterday after being arrested in Paris for buying cocaine. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, following the assassination of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh last month, the militant group has named Yahya Sinwar its top official in Gaza as the new leader of its political bureau. Sinwar, who's 61, is thought by Israel to be the mastermind behind the October the 7th attack by Hamas inside Israeli territory, in which more than 1,100 people were killed and more than 200 others taken captive. Well, I'm joined now by Abeer, who is a Palestinian journalist in Istanbul, and Yossi Mekelberg, Associate Fellow on the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. He's in the studio with me. Welcome to you both. Abeer, what more do we know about this man, Yahya Sinwar?
So Yahya Sinwar is a former Palestinian prisoner, and indeed he is the mastermind for the October 7th attack. So his nomination or his selection, however, came as a surprise because he was more engaged in the military work of the movement. And Sinwar is known to be a hardliner, and he was the reason who put strict conditions for ending the war. And he was not easy to negotiate with, especially that he basically runs the military work of the movement, and he has the Israeli hostages. However, his selection came as a surprise because he is in Gaza, and we don't expect him to be going around the world to do, the tours political leaders usually do, but also his selection can be related to Haniyeh assassination in Iran, because it's known that Sinwar is close to Iran because Iran is closer to the military wing more. So all these things together made the selection the selection process comes to Sinwar. But politically, everyone expected someone who's more, like outside Gaza, as I said, Khalid Mish'al, Khail Haya or so.
Yossi, I know that you know quite a lot about his background. I mean, he spent many years in an Israeli prison.
He spent 22 years in Israeli prison and became a leader within the prison. There's always kind of a very delicate balance between the prisoners that belong to Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and on the other side, the Fatah movement, the more secular, the one that has led the Palestinian movement for many years and the one that leads the PLO. Let's remind ourselves, Hamas is not part of the Palestinian liberation movement. Hamas is outside but still won the election back in 2006. He speaks fluent Hebrew as many Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and he negotiated the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit that led to his release and the exchange for 1,026 Palestinian prisoners for Gilad Shalit. He knows the Israelis know him. He was in jail for abducting being the mastermind of abducting two Israeli soldiers, but also killing Palestinians. And he killed Palestinians. He was accused also of torturing a certain commander of a brigade that he suspected of collaborating with Israel. And I think his appointment is an interesting one. It has an internal logic within the war. I mean, it's almost an act of defiance. He's saying, you assassinated the more pragmatic leader, Haniya, that was spent most of the time in Qatar, not in Iran, but he was in Tehran for the swearing in of the new Iranian president. He's the one that negotiating the release of the prisoners. In the meantime, Israel killed also Muhammad Def and Arouri in Lebanon. So this is almost an act of defense. Now we almost join together the military leadership and the political leadership. What I think it's important what Abeer said, is not going to negotiate in the open the way that Haniya did, because he's somewhere probably in the tunnels. So what does it mean in terms of a ceasefire? What does it mean in terms of the release of the hostages?
I mean, Abeer, what do you think about that? What does it mean for the ceasefire? And also, what does the choice of Sinwar tell us about how important Gaza is to the dynamics within Hamas?
Well, I believe that Sinwar has the upper hand. He has the hostages, and this is the core part of negotiations for Israelis. They want the hostages back in order to negotiate the demands of Palestinians. So it's not easy to negotiate with a man with this mentality, and he has the hostages. We knew that Haniya was more easygoing with negotiations, and that the messages that came from Sinwar were harder, that we want the Israeli troops to withdraw from Gaza before we talk about any release for hostages. For Palestinians in Gaza, the only thing they care about is a ceasefire. Like the only thing they want is the war to end. We don't know yet. We didn't test like how it would go after Haniya was assassinated, but this is the only concern for people now. Like if they hope that the Sinwar would lead negotiations that would end up with ending the war. However, I expect it to be hard. We deal with a man that no one knows where he is, and at the same time, he's in power.
I mean, far from the war ending, it looks like it's now opening up on multiple fronts. Yossi, Israel's ordered residents and displaced Palestinians to evacuate the Beit Hanun area of Gaza City. Local media is warning that a large-scale Israeli army operation is expected to begin there soon. Of course, this is all tied up with Iran. Do we have any detail on this?
Now, what we see is that, repeat, every few days another part of Gaza that was before occupied by Israel and was sold as cleared of Hamas militants. They come back because the IDF is leaving it. They're going back. Then Palestinian civilians are asked to leave, and it's become a merry-go-round. I think the problem, as Abeer said, that there is no horizon for a ceasefire, which is desperately needed. So I think we need to separate between the interest of the leadership and the interest of the people. Sinwar tried to save himself, and probably right now, when the when the others were already killed, he will basically surround himself with the hostages wherever he is, as a sort of a human shield. For Netanyahu, it seems that he is moving into a regional war by provoking Hezbollah and provoking Iran, because for him to stay in power and to stay dealing with his own trial and legal turbulences, he needs to continue the war. In the meantime, you then start wondering, what is the end game of this war? And by moving civilians from now third, fourth, fifth time from place to place, and said the clearing against of militants, and keeping saying, as Netanyahu said in Congress, to achieve total victory, it doesn't look any closer.
And Abeer, finally, I mean, how do we think the Iranian reaction, whatever it is and whenever it comes, might impact the situation within Gaza?
Well, I see the news that Iran might negotiate their reaction, like they might not react or respond if Israel does 1, 2, 3. So the thing that the response is taken this time, and the thing is Hezbollah keeps saying that we will respond, but not now, slowly, like Nasrallah said it literally, a bit, like we will respond in a frame of time that he did not specify. So I think the fact that Iran is delaying the response has to do with some political political negotiations or so. All the choices are possible. Like, we are just waiting. But as I said, there might be some negotiations over the response, or it can be Iran and Hezbollah attacking Israel, which of course mean a regional war.
Abeer, thank you very much. That's Abeer, Ayyoub and also Yossi Mekelberg. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It is 12:13 in Dhaka, that's 7:13 here in London. After the uprising in Bangladesh leading to the resignation of Sheikh Hasina, Professor Muhammud Yunus has been named head of the interim government. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner who invented microfinance and devoted his life to stopping poverty. He developed the Grameen Bank, a system founded on principles of trust and solidarity. His book, A World of Three Zeros, argues that we need a new economic system based on a more realistic vision of human nature. In 2018, I sat down with him for my programme Meet the Writers, and here's some of what he told me about how good ideas can be put into practice even in a world of greedy, authoritarian leaders.
It all depends on you and me, us. What is it that we have inside of us? Do you want to protect? Then we'll protect. Resist those politicians who want to destroy that. Resist those businesses who want to concentrate the planet and so on. They cannot concentrate their wealth if I become an entrepreneur, because I'm not working for him anymore. If I don't work for him, there's no way he can get to this wealth concentration. So I pick up the wealth for myself. And there's billions of people who are picking up their wealth because we are all entrepreneurs. Nobody's working for him or her to concentrate all the wealth of the world into fewer and fewer hands. I said about the 99.9% of the people having tiny, tiny fraction of wealth, and only 0.5% or less than 0.5% will own the bulk of the wealth of the world. But if you look at the geographical distribution, all this wealth is concentrated on probably 6 countries of the world, and the rest of the world doesn't have anything. But in each of these countries, whatever the little they have, you'll see, again, 99% of that little have only controlled by few people. So you have the monopoly of economic power and then monopoly of political power. With the nuclear weapon gives you monopoly power because your voice has to be heard because they take you at ransom. If you don't listen, I have the bomb. I can do anything I want. So people get the message. So you have the two monopolies working together. That's not a safe world.
But we can make it safer?
We can make it safer because that's what I'm saying, that we have to express ourselves. We have to tell our children, look, this is the future. And they have to understand that business is only not for making money. We can solve all the problems that we have around us if we bring our creative power and take our greed out of the picture. The whole thing is the seed of greed planted by the capitalist system. That seed is one which is blown up into this proportion. Today we're talking about the wealth concentration.
And you can hear the full half-an-hour interview in the Meet the Writers archive on our website. And I just have to add here how much I enjoyed meeting him, how the goodness, it felt to me, shone out of him. Now, one of the most pressing concerns in Muhammud Yunus's inbox will be Bangladesh's relationship with India, with which it shares a long and porous border and a great deal of history. Sheikh Hasina, who fled to New Delhi, was one of the country's key strategic partners in the region. And I'm joined now by Maya Sharma, who's a journalist in Bengaluru. Maya, I wondered if you could describe India's relationship with Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina.
Well, Sheikh Hasina has been considered a friend of India. Her father, of course, considered also the father of Bangladesh, independent Bangladesh. And that's a history that goes back because India, of course, being so instrumental in the creation of Bangladesh. So Sheikh Hasina, her family, and the young state of Bangladesh inextricably tied up with India and India's involvement. And when she did come to power in 2009, New Delhi did see this as a kind of relief. It was considered that the others who were in charge of Bangladesh were not quite so India-friendly, whereas Hasina definitely was. She was one good friend for India in this region, where many of the countries are not absolutely very fond of India. She was one friend which India did have here. And that was shown in the big projects that were being signed, in the fact that there was a kind of control being exerted on whether it comes to migration across this border, this very, very long and very porous border between India and Bangladesh. And also it was felt that she was kind of keeping track of insurgents in the northeast of India and maybe doing something about that. So New Delhi, despite the fact that, of course, she was not hugely popular in her own country, did back Hasina, and Hasina did seem close to New Delhi itself.
How will the change in power in Bangladesh affect India's relationship with Pakistan and China?
Well, one of the big concerns, of course, for India when it comes to Bangladesh is that it should not be used as a base for cross-border terrorism, for groups that might actually encourage insurgency in the northeast of India. That is a real concern, that now that she is gone, and with other parties, possibly the BNP and all eventually taking over, it may be that they will give a little more scope for pro-Pakistani elements to actually develop. When it comes to China, there is concern about, among other things, business developments. Huge projects actually came to India, which had initially been earmarked for cooperation with China. So there is concern that if Bangladesh does turn a little bit more towards China, that is one more challenge for India. India has seen that happen when it comes to the Maldives, when it comes to Sri Lanka, a kind of movement perhaps towards China, and China being India's huge rival on so many fronts. That is not good news for India at all. So they would be hoping that the new Bangladesh administration would consider its big neighbor India on this side as important, if not more important than China. So there is that concern that China will, in fact, have a larger role to play in Bangladesh.
So as Yunus flies home from Paris to take up his new role, will the relationship with India be one of his primary concerns? Does Dhaka need New Delhi more than New Delhi needs Dhaka?
Well, if you look at it geographically, Bangladesh is pretty much surrounded on almost all sides by India. It does need India very much when it comes to trade, when it comes to... there's just a whole lot going on between the borders. The Bengali culture of Bangladesh and West Bengal as well. It's a culture which could be considered one continuous culture. So yes, Bangladesh definitely does need India. It has, however, of course, in the last few years been doing better on India in several indices as well when it comes to economic progress. It has, in fact, outstripped India in some places as well. But it does definitely need India. It cannot cut India off. The hope is that, while, of course, the Indian leadership, the diplomatic centers are actually doing what is described as waiting and watching, to use that cliche. They are seeing what will happen. But the belief is that Bangladesh cannot set India aside at all. And the hope is that Muhammud Yunus would also consider India a very important trading partner, political partner, a partner in many ways. I mean, we share such a huge border and a history as well.
Maya, thank you very much indeed. That's Maya Sharma there. Now, still to come on the programme.
Watched any Olympics this past couple of weeks? Well, every second of the action and behind the scenes has been filmed by one company, with 1,200 camera crews producing more than 11,000 hours of footage. I'm Emma Nelson here in Paris, and I'll bring you a preview of our interview with the CEO of the Olympic Broadcasting Company.
This is The Globalist. Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is the Washington-based reporter Simon Marks. I say Washington-based, right now he's based at the table opposite me. Simon, it's really lovely to meet you face to face. We've spoken so often.
Absolutely lovely to meet you as well, Georgina. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for coming in. You're here in Britain, and of course all of the stories in Britain have been about how there are fascists on the rise and all of these very right-wing groups attacking people all over the country. Last night was meant to be this big push. Over 100 places were targeted. Didn't happen.
It did not. It was quite an extraordinary night, in fact, because the entire story pivoted, as you know, from having been told by the government and the police earlier in the day that as many as 100 sites might be targeted by far-right protesters. In fact, in the event, there were only a handful of places where far-right protesters turned up, but instead counter-protesters, anti-racist protesters took to the streets, essentially to take back the streets. And so we're seeing in the newspapers here today just an extraordinary similar pivot, some of them almost beggaring belief. The Daily Mail, a right-wing tabloid here, which has absolutely been accused of stoking some of these protests over the last few weeks, proclaims on its front page today, the night anti-hate marchers faced down the thugs. And it goes even further online with a huge headline saying, Britain stands united, far-right protests fizzle out as tens of thousands of ordinary Brits crowd streets to silence the rioting thugs. It reports that some of the far-right protesters and figures that influence them are claiming that they deliberately lied about the extent of their plans to waste police time last night. I think there are questions, though, about whether this really has fizzled out, whether it really is over, or whether, when sun sets tonight or tomorrow night, there is still the possibility of further confrontation. I can certainly tell you that at the Home Office, they were definitely preparing yesterday for a rough night, and in the event it didn't happen, the government of Sir Keir Starmer will, I think, wonder if they've succeeded, partly in removing the threat from the streets, because over 140 people have been arrested, 3 already jailed yesterday. Still very nervous times ahead.
Although, I mean, how wonderful that these people came out and challenged the right-wing thugs, as the Daily Mail puts it, but there was the bat squeak of anti-Semitism.
Yes, well, there was. In some locations, there were anti-Semitic slogans being chanted at some of those counter-protesters that were taking to the streets. We also saw, I mean, these counter-protests also served as a cauldron for different causes. The Palestinian flag was being being flown by several protesters in various towns and cities. And also, this coincided with the news that there's been record levels of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK in the first half of 2024. The Community Security Trust recording almost 2,000 anti-Jewish hate incidents from January to June, up 105% on the same period 12 months ago.
Talking of hatred, let's speak about Trump. If I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. This is what he said, I think, back in March.
Yes.
Now, Joe Biden is not confident of a peaceful transfer of power if Harris wins the election, so says The Guardian. Tell us more.
Yeah, well, just on the Trump comments, I think it's important to put those into context, because he was, at the time, suggesting there might be a bloodbath over Chinese electric vehicle imports into the United States. Now, nonetheless, he predicted a bloodbath. There's no question about that. And Joe Biden gave his first television interview since he dropped out of the race for the presidency to CBS News yesterday, which The Guardian is reporting today. Joe Biden has said he is not confident there will be a peaceful transfer of power after the November presidential election. If Trump loses, he said, I'm not confident at all. And in many ways, what the President of the United States is doing is pointing to the potential nightmare scenario that we all may be waking up to on November the 6th, the morning after the night before. Because if Kamala Harris wins, but fails to win in a landslide, if it is a closely fought contest, as it is likely to be, we may well find ourselves in a situation where Donald Trump once again insists there have been election irregularities, as he has falsely insisted consistently since November of 2020. And there could be real concerns about how his supporters, voters, and Make America Great Again loyalists react. So I think what President Biden is doing is surfacing not just the fact that democracy is absolutely on the line in this presidential election, as he maintains, but also this worry about what is the morning after the election going to look like, given that one of the two candidates has a track record of not recognising the outcome of elections.
But where is Trump? We haven't seen him for a couple of days.
Well, it's an interesting question. I just looked actually at his website. I can tell you where he's going to be tomorrow. He's going to be in Bozeman, Montana, holding a rally. So he's going to be back on the stage tomorrow. We haven't seen him for a couple of days, and some of his critics have suggested that he's frit, that he's gone off to lick his wounds after this unbelievable launch of Kamala Harris campaign. Now, of course, coupled by Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, her running mate. Wild scenes in Philadelphia when they first appeared a couple of days ago to launch their joint campaign. I mean, if Donald Trump is sensible, he spent the last couple of days trying to hone his strategy for taking on Harris, because he has so far entirely failed to find cogent attack lines to launch against her. Indeed, in the days, for multiple days after Biden dropped out of the race and it was apparent that Harris was going to be the nominee, he was still attacking Biden in all of his rallies, almost as though he was angry that Biden had dropped out because he really wanted him to stay in the race. So maybe he's regrouping, and maybe we'll see a different speech from him when he rallies in Montana tomorrow.
Let's talk about a different kind of race. Now, there are two ways to do this story. One could be a scientific study of gut microbiomes that predicts future success, or we could just say, and it's Monocle, so we will, let's talk about racehorse poo.
I'm very interested in this story. This is the BBC reporting today that the future success of a racehorse can be detected in the animal's gut when it is just 1 month old, because researchers have studied the poo of foals and discovered that the more types of gut microbes that a foal has at just 4 weeks old, directly correlates not only to its future health, but also to its success on the racecourse. Now, there's a potential impact on all of this for the study of human health as well, because, increasingly researchers are looking at the importance of the microbiome in all of us in terms of developing our own long-term health prospects. I have to say that as far as the horse poo story is concerned, I have a personal interest in this because my late grandfather was a tipster here in London, to celebrities, in fact. He was a turf accountant, including among them Chico Marx of the Marx Brothers. And he had a very successful run until he didn't have a very successful run. And then everything went wrong and, he lost a lot of money. And if only he had understood the importance of sifting through the poo of foals, we might have had a very, very different family history.
Simon, can you give me a tip for the 235 at Ascot?
Definitely not.
Simon Marks, very, very many thanks for being with us. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Last night, Britain was prepared for expected far-right violence, which ultimately failed to materialise. Instead, thousands of police and anti-racism protesters gathered on streets across the country to challenge the spate of recent racist attacks. Taylor Swift's 3 shows in Vienna this week have been cancelled after the government confirmed a planned terrorist attack at the concert stadium. Though Swifties are no doubt disappointed, Austria's Chancellor said a tragedy has been prevented. And Australian Olympic hockey player Tom Craig was released from police custody with a warning yesterday after being arrested in Paris for buying cocaine. Craig, a silver medalist in 2021, has apologised, saying his actions do not reflect the values of the Australian Olympic team. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Russia says Ukraine has launched a cross-border incursion in the Kursk region, backed by armoured vehicles and aerial support. It would appear to be a major offensive that's left Moscow scrambling to reinforce the area. A state of emergency has been imposed. Well, Julia Lasica is a researcher and a writer here at Monocle. She's currently in Kyiv. Julia, I want to talk about your journey and how you're finding going home, but I would first like to look at this news that's coming out of the country. I wonder if you could locate us geographically. Where is Kursk?
Hi, Georgina. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, of course. So Kursk is to the sort of northeast of Ukraine. It's on the northeast border with Russia, and it's just to the east of Sumy, which is a kind of a major city in Ukraine, and that's being attacked all the time. And so, yeah, this is a sort of a border with Ukraine that Russia is now defending.
And I just trying to understand why the region's so important. And I understand this might have something to do with the gas hub, and in fact, the only point of entry for Russian gas into the EU.
That is definitely true. Actually, there were conversations that Ukrainian soldiers were reporting yesterday when they were talking to locals. They were talking about what might happen to the gas that's coming out of their region as Ukrainian troops are advancing into the country. But I think it's also just sort of a weak point that Ukrainians have found in the Russian defences, and they're sort of making use of the situation as it evolves. Because, of course, the situation across the front line in Ukraine is very difficult. There are advances on the eastern, by the Russian troops, there are advances on Ukraine's eastern Donbass front. So it's sort of a weak point that Ukrainians have found in the defences.
And is this one of the first major operations for Ukraine's new F-16s, the fighter jets?
Exactly. Well, no, no one has confirmation that F-16s are being used. And in fact, it seems almost likely that they are not, because Ukrainians have said that at the moment, there are too few of them to deploy them too close to the front lines where Russian defense systems can shoot them down. So from what it seems, the F-16s are sort of watching from afar. There has been no confirmation at all that they are involved. I think it's much too early days to know at all how they're being involved, but it will be an interesting situation to see evolve when we see first signs of them being used.
And in fact, there hasn't been any confirmation from Kyiv, really, apart from one MP who was sort of quoted vaguely that this operation is indeed happening. There has been a big reaction from Russia, though.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So Ukrainians have kept silence on this, which is a big sense of progress because before, there would be reportage of all the Ukrainian advance plans plans to advance in advance, and the Americans, for example, were not warned about this counteroffensive. So for Ukrainians, this is big progress because there's a sense that the Ukrainian army can operate in silence, it can take the enemy by surprise, it isn't weighed down by this kind of responsibility to be open with the media and let them know every single detail of the plan. Russia, on the other hand, have had a huge reaction. Yesterday, Putin chaired an emergency meeting. He seemed very sort of taken aback by what was happening, very concerned, and he called it, in fact, a provocation that the Ukrainians are carrying out on their northern border with Russia, which was very interesting, and I think for many Ukrainians, quite an experience.
Julia, it's a year since you've been home. We waved goodbye to you on a Wednesday. It wasn't until the Friday you arrived there. Tell us about the journey. How challenging was that?
Well, I mean, all Ukrainians and foreigners who are coming to visit Ukraine, they have to make this journey because currently the airspace over Ukraine is closed. You cannot fly planes in and out of the country, civilian planes. So it involves taking a plane to, many take a plane to Warsaw, and then from there, 2 different trains or maybe 1 direct train if you're lucky. But yeah, it is a bit of an odyssey and it involves kind of overnight. But there's something also quite romantic about it. I was in a carriage with 3 other women, and it was very interesting to hear about their experiences. So it's a very communal experience that, you might not get if you're just sitting on a plane going straight somewhere. So you do find out a lot about other people's lives when you're traveling in this more old-fashioned way. And of course, entering into Ukraine altogether as well is a very sort of heartwarming experience, seeing the Ukrainian flag and being on Ukrainian land. It's all very exciting and, really heartwarming to be back here.
How have you found the experience? How's morale? How is the city coping?
I think it's tricky because obviously every night there are air raid alerts. So people find that hard. They talk about developing an immunity almost as if it's sort of a disease that they have to battle every single night. They have to kind of put up with sleep deprivation. They have to, if they're still following safety protocols very closely, they have to sort of rush to their shelter or rush to their kind of safe room in their flat. And I think morale is tricky because there's, we've discussed on Monocle Radio before, a really difficult push now for Ukrainian mobilization. Ukrainian troops who are on the front have been there for more than 2 years now. They need rotation. There is not enough Ukrainian men going forward to be mobilized, to go to the front. So it's a very mixed picture. I think that the Kursk operation, is definitely helping Ukrainians feel that there is still a creativity about their army. There's still like clever thinking that's going into the operations, and they're not just getting bogged down in eastern operations where the situation is very, very difficult. And Russia definitely has the upper hand in terms of kind of brutal weapons that they use just sort of to destroy positions. So it's really tricky. But I mean, the experience of being back in the city is just great. The weather is amazing. Gardens are in abundance of vegetables and fruits. It's just a wonderful time to be with my family. But, life is there's a mixture of emotions at the moment.
And Julia, I just wonder if you get any sense from the people there of how or when this will end.
I don't think anyone has any answers. I think that this war has been, and Ukraine's response to this war has been just marked by surprises. We can see that in Kursk, what is happening now. Ukrainians are hoping that things are moving forward towards the regaining of Crimea. And there are, many pointers to that. There was a raid on a Russian position near Crimea, kind of on the border, the night before last. And so I think Ukrainians are sort of waiting with hope that something will change, and there will be sort of a surprise. And definitely there's this feeling now that the army is not sharing plans in advance. So I guess it's about just helping as much as you can in civil society, volunteering, continuing to give money and not giving up hope, even though the situation is changing all the time with, Biden stepping down. That was a sort of sense of relief for Ukrainians. Of course, he is a great statesman, but bringing in fresh ideas, fresh people, Kamala Harris, and now Tim Walz, who is, of course, a great supporter of Ukraine. So it's sort of just riding the wave and just hoping that things will be okay.
Julia, thank you so much, and please be safe. That's Monocle's own Julia Lasica, and you're with Monocle Radio. After years of negotiations, last week it emerged that a plea deal had been reached with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, and two other alleged perpetrators of the September the 11th, 2001 attacks on New York and Washington. Prosecutors had taken the death penalty off the table in exchange for a guilty plea, but the ensuing reaction was so severe that US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has now blocked the deal, which was approved by a military commission in Guantanamo Bay, taking the whole saga back to square one. Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with Eugene Fidel, who's a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and a counsel at the Washington law firm Feldersman Leifer LLP, focused on military law. Chris began by asking Eugene exactly how long prosecutors had been working on a plea deal with the 9/11 masterminds.
There have been repeated efforts over years to resolve the 9/11 cases before the military commissions at Guantanamo by a pretrial agreement or plea bargain. They've been on again, off again. There was an effort a few years ago to try to reach an agreement, and the person then in charge, a very capable lawyer, civilian, wound up being fired because the management did not like the fact that he was entering into plea negotiations. Then several more years passed. Several more people became the so-called convening authority for military commissions. In other words, the person who has to approve a pretrial agreement. And the prosecutors continued to have discussions with defense counsel, and they came up with a deal. The deal they originally had, which was, I think, a year or two ago, included a number of provisions, some of which were quite controversial, such as fairly cushy confinement arrangements for the rest of the defendants' lives. And that got vetoed as a result, I believe, of at least some pressure by some family members of people who were killed on 9/11. But the prosecutors and the defense counsel continued to try to work a deal, and they came up with a deal. And the heart of the deal appears to be, since the actual documents have not yet been made public, it appears to be that it took the death penalty off the table. It provided that they would plead guilty, and it provided that they would waive their right to appellate review. And that's the deal that was struck. And the other day, on the 31st of last month, it was approved by a retired brigadier general named Susan Escalier, who is the incumbent convening authority for military commissions. She had the power to approve it, and she approved it.
Now, Eugene, I mean, this was always going to be unpopular, although, as you say, families to some extent were already involved before this, so they had some say. But I just wonder maybe why the surprise, before we get to what the U.S. Defense Secretary did. Did the military commission consider the popularity of this at all?
I assume that the line prosecutors who negotiated the deal and General Escalier, who approved it, were aware that it would be controversial because everything about this has been radioactive for years. Remember, at one point during the Obama administration, there was a move to shift all these cases to federal district court, the civilian court, in Lower Manhattan. And that went sideways when Mayor Bloomberg, the then mayor of New York, who hadn't been consulted, objected to having controversial trials, potentially, explosive trials in Lower Manhattan. And so, everybody has known that this was going to be a problem. And it's a problem that has sort of been cultivated by the Republicans in Congress, who have made it impossible for us either to bring the Guantanamo defendants into the mainland U.S., they're all stuck in Cuba, or offload them to other countries if we could find some that were willing to take them. I mean, it's become a very cumbersome process. Now, how much did Secretary Austin know? When did he know it? We'll be finding out more about that. And who, if anybody, consulted the White House? And consultations themselves are problematic because the convening authority is supposed to be exercising her own sound discretion on whether to accept plea bargains. So It's really quite a train wreck, as I called it in one of our publications here in the U.S.
And to that point then about who knew what, do we imagine that the military commission would have known that Secretary Austin would get involved the way he did, the fact that he was able to essentially cancel this plea deal, and where does that leave us?
Well, the validity of his action, I think, is open to grave doubt, and I've written that I think he violated the Military Commissions Act by inserting himself after the fact. I don't think he had the authority to revoke part of General Escalier's power, and because he didn't have the authority, his tearing up of the pretrial agreements, which he did the other day, I think is invalid. And I think you're going to see litigation in the military commission itself before a military judge and appellate review one way or the other. So this is going to, ironically, prolong what has already been a much too lengthy process, depriving families and loved ones of closure. Some of them want closure, some of them want vengeance. But the day of reckoning is going to be put off by, I think, a couple more years.
Just finally, Eugene, given all of this and the complications that we've been talking about with these specific plea deals, is it your expectation that Guantanamo Bay will ever be closed? This is something that so many presidents, particularly Democratic ones, Obama and Biden, have tried to do. And also, whether it's closed or not, have we learned anything from this? Would we go down this road a second time if there were, a similar strike, similar terrorism cases going forward?
Well, I'll take those in reverse order. I don't think we've learned anything from this exercise. I think the notion that this has gone on for decades is preposterous, and it's costing people a fortune. It's costing the taxpayers of the United States a fortune to keep Guantanamo in business as a prison. The precedent that comes to mind is the prison in Berlin, Spandau prison, that was the site where some of the Nazi big shots were held after World War II. And it finally got down to, I think, 3 and then 2. And then finally, one person was being held there. If you remember, Albert Speer was held there and another Nazi big shot. And it cost the United States and the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and the other occupying powers in Berlin a fortune to keep that prison open for decades for a single individual or two individuals. And, that's a terrible precedent. It's ridiculous, in fact. And that's where we are. And it's a complete failure of courage on the part of our political leadership that they've been unwilling to bite the bullet on this.
The lawyer Eugene Fidel there speaking with Monocle's Chris Chermak. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now it's time for a roundup of aviation news, and I'm with the aviation analyst, Sally Gethin. Thank you very much for coming into the studio, Sally. Let's start with flight delays, because, of course, we had the whole IT dropout, and that really seriously affected flights all over the world, really. But what you're saying, and this is an article you wrote yourself, that's nothing compared to what's coming.
Well, what's already happening, so hot on the heels of that IT outage, which broke headlines, like you said, all around the world, came further delays. And I suppose this is the hidden factor behind a lot of disruption during the summer holidays. And airlines like EasyJet and Ryanair in Europe are hopping mad about it because they feel it's preventable. It's basically down to air traffic control capacity issues, which really is about managing the numbers of aeroplanes in the sky at any one time. And it requires a huge amount of planning and the integration of a lot of different air traffic control centres across Europe and in the UK. And it's a very difficult nut to crack. A lot of planning has to go into it. There's no short fix to this problem because there are simply more planes in the sky now than ever. Air traffic has increased between 10 and 20% in the last year. And also bad weather's on the increase, exacerbating it. And then when you factor in, problems in Ukraine, geopolitical aspects, this all has a knock-on effect. And it really leaves sometimes passengers on the ground for much longer than airlines and the passengers would want.
Just a quick aside here. What language do air traffic controllers communicate in?
English.
It's always English?
Yes.
How fascinating. Now, Boeing is rarely out of the news, but they've got a new CEO, so perhaps it's better news for them coming up.
Well, all of us in the industry, the watchers and people on the inside, we're all keeping our fingers crossed now that this signals the start of a new positive era for Boeing. They're bringing a veteran from the industry into the top job, Kelly Ortberg. He has a very impressive legacy of steering a US aerospace giant, Rockwell Collins, over recent decades. He's a mechanical engineer by training. He gets on very well with engineers, which is and hopefully will grasp the nettle of re-engineering, if you like, the safety culture and aerospace quality standards at Boeing, which is really what's required, which has been lacking and behind some of the awful headlines we've seen. For example, the Lasica Airlines plug door blowout. So yes, it signals a good direction of travel. But he has a massive in tray to clear because it's a huge company. It has defence and space as well. So it's not just the commercial airplanes business that he has to steer through very strong turbulence right now.
Let's go from Boeing to its chief rival, which is Airbus, and they've just scored a massive order with Cathay Pacific.
Yes, this is very interesting. So Cathay Pacific is regarded as a bit of an old school legacy airline. And unfortunately for airlines like that, it comes with old school aircraft often. But now Cathay Pacific says it's investing $12 billion in a massive upgrade across all its operations, but in particular new aircraft. It's ordered 30 Airbus A330-900 aircraft for the mid-size wide-body range, which in plain speak means it will help cover the dense routes regionally in Asia-Pacific, but also for longer-haul routes with an option for 30 more. And don't forget, Hong Kong, its base, is completing a third runway by the end of this year. So it looks all clear for takeoff for Cathay Pacific.
And it needs this third runway because there are just this proliferation of Chinese airlines.
Yes, so obviously China was on the back foot for a long time after COVID, was the slowest to come out of the COVID pandemic with air traffic recovery. But now it's really catching up and travel is booming, and there's a big rivalry going on amongst all those airlines in that region, and a need for more expertise, pilots, personnel coming in, aircraft, as with Cathay Pacific. So yeah, it's really going through a big, strong growth spike.
And finally, before we let you go, let's have a chat about this Brazilian playmaker, that's Embraer, which has signed this $1 billion credit deal. Yes,
so Embraer is really showing great ambition at the moment. It was at the Farnborough Air Show recently and talking very confidently about its position. It's the third largest plane maker in the world, but it serves the 150-seater downwards market. So the smaller jet market, both for commercial air transport and for the corporate part of the world. Now, it's important to get that credit line for it because it ups its credit rating and it gives it much better terms for negotiation. But in terms of finance for all its plans. But yeah, Embraer is definitely one to watch. It doesn't have the problems that Boeing and Airbus have with parts and lots of other little issues like that. Well, big issues actually. And it really has a strong plan for the next 20 years in increasing its foothold in this very dynamic regional long-haul market.
Sally, thank you very much indeed. That's aviation analyst Sally Gethin there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Finally, let's head to Paris to join the Monocle team there, who are in place to bring you live radio from the heart of the Olympic city. Well, Emma Nelson joins me now from Maison Alliance to tell us what will be in the show at the top of the hour, but also, Emma, to answer a question about your social life there. So Lily Austin, who is our studio manager here, has just returned from Paris, where she was sharing an apartment with you. And she says...
Good morning, Lily. Good morning, Gigi.
She says that you were hosting fabulous dinner parties.
Well, Lily and I teamed up because obviously we need to, we're like, so in the Olympics, obviously everyone divides into teams and they have nations, lots of people have nations, and we have Team Monocle. And we're working hard out here, and I'm sure that Lily will vouch for the fact that hard work is hungry work. And so Lily and I cobbled together and made a couple of meals. We haven't gone bananas, but it's just a very, very important thing to break bread with your colleagues. Because after an end of a day of an awful lot of walking and traipsing, I know we're making it sound like really hard work, but it is very, very important to have some downtime. And speaking of breaking bread, Laura Kramer is here with baguettes from the world's or France's best bakery. Is that correct? Paris's best bakery. You see, it's good that she's going to come on the radio later because I'll find out what it's all about. But she's brought in baguettes, award-winning baguettes, which we will be fighting over. It can get nasty out here because bread's pretty good.
I'm quite sure. Listen, tell me what's coming up on the show.
Right, so when you watch the Olympics, anywhere where you are in the world, you are not watching your country's television company filming everything, because that would just be bananas. There'd be no room for anything. So everything that you and I watch on the television or online or wherever has to be run by an organisation called the Olympic Broadcasting Service. And they're absolutely massive. They are making something like 11,000 hours of content. That's apparently a year in the 2 weeks that the Olympics are on. And they've got 1,200 camera crews out there at every single event and at the opening and closing ceremonies and going behind the scenes as well. And I've spoken to their chief executive, and we'll have a really interesting interview coming up in the next few minutes where he talks about how nowadays when you are broadcasting to so many people all around the world, tailoring things to your audience is an enormous job. For example, you have to make your, let's say you're Brazil, and you're the Brazilian television organisation, you will ask the Olympic Broadcasting Service for two things. You'll ask for the sports that your Brazilian audience are going to enjoy. And also, you're going to ask for highlights specifically of the games or the events that your athlete is going to stand a high chance of getting a medal for. So not only are you geographically having to get everything right, what we'll hear about in a little while is that you also have to consider the fact that an 87-year-old grandma watching traditional television is going to be a completely different audience to an 8 or 9-year-old who's grown up exclusively online. So they're having to think of 6 generations worth of audiences. So I went up to Le Bourget, which is this sort of quite deserted airfield up in the north of Paris. It's a little private airport, but they've built this exhibition centre in it. And in that centre, there's this just huge broadcasting outlet. I mean, there are literally thousands upon thousands of screens, 800 people all in there, all taking in feeds, doing highlights, doing everything. It was a breathtaking experience, and we'll hear about that in a moment.
I'm very excited about that. I'm also very sad that we don't have time to talk about Tom Webb going to the weightlifting, because I don't know if you ever accidentally touched his arm. The man is made of steel.
I've done more than that. I've worked out with him. I have worked out with Tom Webb, and that man can lift the weight of a small village. Well, he is a colossus.
He is a colossus.
He's whip it thin. Slight, very nimble, but my God, you want him to carry... If anybody could carry your bags at the airport, it's Tom Webb.
Well, luckily he's there and travelling with you. Emma Nelson will be back with you at the top of the hour. That's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Chris Chermack and Monica Lillis, our researcher, Sana Jimani, and our studio manager, Lily Austin. The briefing is at midday and The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. Of course, The Daily comes from Paris at 1800 London time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.